And also, I'm very grateful for these opportunities to and for ACF to organize this event to have these opportunities to present some of the key findings of the report. Please allow me to share the slides first. To a wider audience, the report has been introduced, have been done last year regarding the role of how to scale China's green energy investment in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm presenting today on behalf of our colleagues, Frenton, Dr. Chiamura from Open University, and Dr. Soon-to-be Yushi Chen from University of Sussex. And to say something about the context of this report, you heard of, many of you have heard of these facts again and again regarding how many people, how large the population in Africa still kind of remain unconnected to the electricity system, and the low level of energy consumption compared to the global average, and so on. And the electricity price is not affordable and it's not reliable, with blackouts crippling industries and so on. You can be overwhelmed of these facts, but what does that mean? And to us, I think one of the important implications that we're facing an unprecedented challenge for African countries, because all of these three types of challenges, most of the countries in the world actually address them one by one and solve them one by one in decades' time, if not in centuries' time. But in terms of African countries, we have to deal with all these issues in one go. And that is the unprecedented challenges. And that's why renewable energies emerge as a major part of the solution, because it can, at least on the paper, address all these issues with more affordable, it's become more and more affordable and reliable with battery technologies, and can be applied in both rural and urban context, and of course its claim. But scaling renewables require tremendous financial and technology and governance capacities that many African countries at present are lacking. So according to International Energy Agency, we are, and the financial gap alone is about $2 trillion between now and 2040 to solve all the challenges that we just mentioned. So the question obviously is that whether China can help. When we are asked these questions, I would like to argue is that I always think about Chinese finance and also to some extent Chinese technology. But what I would like to argue is how the Chinese experience actually can help. I'm sorry, because China faced similar challenges in the past few decades. For example, in the 1970s, when China tried to elevate its electricity excess from below 50% to above 85% in just about a decade. And also similarly, in the early 2000s, China built up its wind and solar capacities at home, not just the power generation capacities, but also industrial and manufacturing capacities hand in hand, again, in a kind of a decade time frame. So all these, I'm not saying that all these measures and policies and developments can be just copy and paste into African context, but at least some discussion of knowledge sharing, capacity building should be in place, which is now kind of lacking, and both among academics and in the practitioners' world. So with this context, we're talking about the current Chinese activities in African energy sectors. The data we have is never precise because the different data sets from different universities sometimes conflict with each other, understandably, because there are too many misinformations about Chinese projects here and there, which sometimes never happened. And the official data is very limited from both sides. So at our best guess, we assume there are about 17 17 to 18 new gigawatts capacities being added into African energy systems because of due to Chinese investment and involvement. And if you look at these capacities added, they are largely evenly distributed among Western, Eastern, and Southern African countries, with Central African countries received much less. And also, if you look at energy mix, 50% of these capacities are from hydro, 45% are from fossil fuels, and 7% are from the so-called unconventional or non-hydro renewables. It is clear that these activities are mainly based on African countries' own energy, at least current energy endowment. So if the host country do have coal, the Chinese come in to build coal power plants. If the host country have hydro, the Chinese build hydro, and so on. So 90% of these projects are from the large state-owned enterprises. 80% of these projects are backed by the state financial and so-called DFIs, Development Finance Institutes. This is a kind of a landscape statistics. And in this report, we also focus on two specific countries, Ethiopia and South Africa, because these two countries are kind of closely related, have a relatively long history to engage with Chinese renewable energy companies and have relatively more completed renewable energy projects. These two countries are very interesting is that they share a lot of commonalities, despite all the differences about energy access rate, political and commercial risks and manufacturing capacities. But think about it, both countries are dominated by a single energy source, coal in South Africa and hydro in Ethiopia. And because of that, there's a strong political systems involved around this single energy source. And they're controlled by the state-owned utilities, Eskom in South Africa, EP in Ethiopia, and have some monopoly power on power generation, distribution, and transmission, and so on. So it's a very similar system we're engaging. And also the changes, the ongoing sector reforms, it's always on agenda, but it's highly incremental. There are political struggles between incumbent and the so-called new elites, new reformists, and so on. Why this matters? Because the political struggles between two sides provide opportunistic investment for both sides. So that is the key factors for us to understand Chinese involvement in energy systems in these two countries. And also, we would like to argue that the differences in terms of energy access and political risks and commercial risks and manufacturing capacities, in our investigations, at least, plays a much less important role in terms of decision-making among Chinese investors. So we found about less than 15 utility scale projects in those countries. There are more than 10 dozens of Chinese companies involved. There are large SOEs. There are new kind of private companies as well, particularly in solar sectors. So altogether, the total capacity of these projects is about 1.4 gigawatts. Interestingly, some of them are very new to the African market. For example, Longyuan, for example, Chint and GCL, these are the newcomers. And the first comers are actually for them in the African market. But there are companies, Sanyi, Dongfang, Camco, have been engaging African markets for decades, even if they are not really in the renewable energy sectors previously. So the general features of this investment is that SOEs are playing a much more important role increasingly, but these are they show a kind of very adaptive and flexible model because, as I said, they are versatile. They can produce different energy solutions on different energy sources. That really speaks to the power struggles and opportunistic investment on both sides that I just mentioned, introduced before. And also another finding is that newcomers face particular struggles in African markets. So after one or two projects, for a typical example is Longyuan, after one or two projects, they literally normally stopped to seeking new project opportunities. But the old school companies are actually gradually increasing their profile in renewable energy projects in many African countries. And there's a problem of recognition of reputation of Chinese technologies. Some wind turbines are not very well recognized, at least at the early stage. And some solar panels are deemed not very high quality. And there's an image issue of Chinese construction companies regarding environmental and social impacts and so on. But all these perceptions in our investigation is changing kind of gradually in the last 10 years and become more and more positive about Chinese technologies and the way they do business. At home in China, the governance system is quite fragmented and involving at least 4 major ministries in the governance of in the decision-making process of overseas energy activities. All of them have veto power, but actually the project screening and selection is dwelling on these so-called DFIs, Development Finance Institutes, who developed very strong alliances with large SOEs I just mentioned. In energy sectors, this particularly 4 large energy construction company groups takes the lion's share of the projects. So this is another kind of incumbent group we're talking about within China, because the models they're providing, EPC, DFI and sovereign guarantee model that works so well in the last 2 or 3 decades. So they are very reluctant to welcome new ideas, new models, and new actors into the picture. So that's another kind of cluster of actors we're talking about. Incumbent actors we're talking about. So lastly, the policy implications. We need strong policy signals and targets, very clear ones from both sides. I mean, in China, we have very specific policy targets on energy production domestically. Each 5 years, each 1 year, for how much for solar, how much for wind. Such targets is absolutely absent for overseas activities. It's a huge contrast between how they deal with domestic market and overseas market. In African countries, because of the struggles I mentioned, there's no clear message and provide opportunities for investment from both sides. They need to be, if not completely prevented, but at least reduced in years to come with clearer policy signals. With clearer policy signals, we can think about how to improve project screening processes from both sides. We need to think about new school and at the same time focusing on transforming the old ones, because we need niche investment, niche business models, financial models, and so on, to showcase that there's an alternative routes that can be later on scaling up or taken up by the old school, hopefully. And we need to facilitate institutional engagement beyond kind of a bilateral high-level diplomatic talks like we will have very soon in FOCAC, something like that. Because, as I said, knowledge sharing, knowledge building is crucial. And the engagement of think tanks from both sides, civil societies from both sides, in addition to the business level engagement, and also on the ground policymakers engagement, capacity buildings are all needed, but at the same time kind of absent in nurturing a favorable environment to scaling up renewable energy activities for African countries. I will just stop here. I think I welcome comments and critics from our excellent panelists. But I would like to introduce the chair of our panel session, Dr. Frenton Chiamora, which is a good friend and actually the lead author of the report I just presented. So Dr. Chiamora is a lecturer in international development at the School of Social Sciences and Global Studies at the Open University in the UK. And his research focuses on the role of China in Africa's development trajectories, and is particularly interested in Chinese financing and development of the so-called critical infrastructure, including renewable energy, space infrastructure, telecommunications, transport, and more recently, the BRI initiatives in African countries, and how such projects actually contribute to inclusive growth and structural economic transformation. Frenton, you have the virtual floor. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Wei, for the introduction as well as the overview of the reports. Yeah, good morning, evening, or afternoon, depending with where you are. We welcome you to this report. So today we have a very well-versed and well-knowledgeable panel who are going to speak to some of the findings from the report, as well as reflect on their own personal experiences of dealing or engaging with the Chinese in the context of renewable energy infrastructure development in Africa. So to kickstart the conversations, I'm going to invite to the floor Mr. Suji Chiao, who is a senior engineer at the China Renewable Energy Institute, which is based in Beijing. And at the China Renewable Energy Institute, Mr. Suji Chiao works on stuff on research, technological innovation, and standards making in China and abroad, specifically within the context of renewable energy development. The China Renewable Energy Engineering Institute continues to play an important role through their consultation services in renewable energy projects involving Chinese enterprises at home and abroad. So Mr. Chiao will reflect from a technical as well as engineering perspective on Chinese involvement in Africa's renewable energy projects. He will also briefly highlight his personal experience around his role on technical consultation for projects involving Chinese state as well as private enterprises in renewable energy in Africa. So without further ado, I invite you, Mr. Suji, to the platform.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone. I'm particularly grateful to the organizer for providing this valuable opportunity. Please allow me to share my screen. Okay, Professor Shen just made a perfect introduction of the report, which has a very detailed analysis on the development of clean energy in SSA region and the problems existing in Chinese enterprise investment in Africa. Those have benefited me a lot. Now, please allow me combine with my own work. Let me talk about the thinking of clean energy development in Africa. Just as the report says, over the past 2 decades, African economy has been growing continuously. Africa is expected to be one of the fastest growing regions in the world. And Africa is committed to accelerating energy development to maintain such a high growth and improve people's living standards. And Africa is endowed with excellent clean energy resource. It has the longest river, the Nile, and the largest water system, the Congo River. So the technical exploitable capacity of water energy resource is about 1.75 trillion kilowatt hours, which is accounting for about 12% of the world. Africa also has the highest theoretical reserves of the wind energy in the world, accounting for about 30% of the global wind power resource. Meanwhile, Africa has abundant solar energy resources, and solar radiation accounts for about 51% on the Earth. At present, clean energy development has been rooted in the priority item of the Agenda 2063. It is a long-term vision adopted by African leaders through the African Union. Nevertheless, the extent of the clean energy development and utilization is still very low in Africa. We have to notice that the lack of power supply has become a key constraint to its economic development. The water energy utilization rate is about 10% on the African continent. It is far lower than the world average level, which is 60%. The installed capacity of wind power and PV power account for less than 1% of the world. And on the African continent, over 600 million people and 10 million small or medium-sized enterprises have to face the electric shortage. With abundant clean energy resources, Africa has a great potential for large-scale development and utilization of clean energy, but the utilization degree is still very low. What's the reason? And we think it's mainly because of the three reasons as below. First, the rural areas are very vast, remote, and populous and scattered in Africa. So as for the investment, operation, and maintenance cost of power transmission and distribution works is very high, and the loss of power transmission and transformation equipment is great, so that the excessive investment is required in power grid extension and is very difficult to bear the cost in the remote area. Second, the fluctuation and randomness of the new energy outputs, such as wind power and PV power generation, have high requirements for the stable operation of power grids. However, the power grid facilities in Africa are generally weak. With weak stable operation capacity, the power grid has a limited acceptance capacity of new energy. And third, hydropower and other clean energy resources are unevenly distributed, and the interconnection and transmission capacity of power grid are insufficient. For example, the planned Inga 3 power station on the Congo River has a design capacity of 4.8 million kilowatts. Although Congo DRC is also facing power shortage, it cannot consume such huge power generation. The power load in Africa is mainly concentrated in a few countries in Southern and Northern Africa. The coverage of the existing power grid is limited, and the scale of power exchange is very small. So it cannot meet the needs of the long-distance delivery, which is an important reason for the long-term lack of the substantive progress of the Inga 3 project. Facing the dilemma of clean energy utilization in Africa, we think we should take a long-term view and focus on the overall situation and make an overall plan. And the general idea of the clean energy development in Africa, we think, first, we should promote the development and the construction of off-grid new energy in remote area. Meanwhile, on the basis of scientific coordination of the power supply layout and power grid construction, strengthening cross-industry overall cooperation to form an integrated power market of the power generation, transmission, and utilization. And we also have some specific suggestions, include, first, I think we should consistently combine off-grid and on-grid power, promote the power consumption planning for the people without electricity in remote areas, advance the investment and construction of the off-grid new energy according to the local conditions, such as the resource conditions, and help to do a very good job in the policy research of the relevant supporting guarantee. Second, in combining with the characters and developing conditions of clean energy resources in Africa, and on the basis of the development of hydropower resources, promote the large-scale development and utilization of solar energy, wind energy, and other new energies, and build and improve a stable, clean, economic, and sustainable energy system dominated by the hydropower and complemented by multiple energies. Third, we think we should take the developmental opportunity of the Grand Inga project to properly fulfill the top-level planning and design of the clean energy basis. For example, hydropower effectively solve the problem of no power for industrial development and no market for power development, and strengthen intergovernmental overall coordination to plan and guide Chinese enterprises to invest in Africa clean energy. I think I have finished. Please forgive me for any inappropriate points. Thank you very much. Frank.
Well, thanks a lot, Suji. And yeah, well, it's fine. I like the fact that you have raised a very critical point here, specifically around the grid-based electricity distribution or network in Africa, and how it could potentially be one of the biggest challenges in ensuring that everyone has access to energy in Africa. So without further ado now, I would like to invite Yangji Sarah Tang to the platform to speak to us today from a financing perspective. Sarah Tang is a green finance researcher at the Green Belt and Road Initiative Center, which is at the Institute of Green Finance based in Beijing. She tracks the latest development of Chinese overseas investment policies and strategies in the BRI countries. She works closely with the multilateral development banks, Chinese ministries, policy banks, and state-owned enterprises to identify gaps between Chinese international project financing practices, as well as Chinese companies and financial institutions. So she is one of the co-authors for the report on the China Third-Party Market Cooperation Infrastructure Projects, Financing Mechanism and Handbook. So her latest article speaks to green development guidelines for overseas investment cooperation and what does this mean for BRI investment strategies in the BRI participating countries. So before joining the IAGF, Sarah has worked on insurance and banking sectors, climate risk assessment for projects at the United Nations Environmental Programme Financing Initiative in Switzerland, as well as the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation in Canada. She holds a master's degree in environmental studies from University of Waterloo in Canada. As I'd said earlier on, so she will reflect on the Green BRI, looking at the financing aspect around Chinese involvement in renewable energy projects in Africa. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks for the comprehensive intro, Frenton, and thanks for Wei and Shuji's brilliant presentations. Congratulations again to the team on the great report that unpacks the constraints for scaling up Chinese non-hydro investments in SSA. Absolutely a delightful read. As mentioned, my background is on green finance. Our Green BRI Center's mission is greening Chinese overseas investments. I collab with MDBs, Chinese ministries, export credit agencies, and state-owned enterprises. These are also identified in the report as the key players to potentially accelerate China's investments in wind and solar projects in Africa. So I was tasked to provide some of my reflections of the latest developments on Chinese overseas investment strategies and talk a little bit about available green finance instruments. I want to do so by responding to two of the challenges identified in the report. First, the lack of green agenda among key Chinese players for its overseas financing and investments. Two latest announcements from the top down here in China very recently might change this situation forever, I would say. In July this year, Chinese Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Ecology and Environment co-issued the Green Development Guidance for Overseas Investments and Cooperation. This is a policy document considered as soft law here in China, specifically asks Chinese companies to stick to the green development concept throughout their overseas activities. It also encourages the practices of EIA, environmental impact assessment, and due diligence according to internationally accepted standards. And most importantly, the document explicitly asks Chinese companies to support investments in solar, wind, and other forms of clean energy. From my view, it sends a clear signal to both the companies and Chinese policy banks and ECAs, including China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, and Sinosure. I would say this could be a game changer to shake up the no clear green agenda from China obstacle that exists for a very long time. The second I want to add is the latest pledge at UNGA by China of no longer building overseas coal power plants. This is a much anticipated move built upon the momentum of G7 countries' similar commitments earlier. And it also combined with fewer demands from the host countries. I think like especially in Asia, like Indonesia, Bangladesh. So combining the two, the picture is much more clear. China is gradually shifting its overseas energy investment strategies, at least from the top down, to favor more renewable projects. The second challenge highlighted in the report, I want to add some of my nuances on, is the current financing setup does not accommodate small-scale projects very well. For example, I learned from the report, most of the Chinese enterprises involved in the wind and solar sectors are not prepared to bid for small projects, evident from the fieldwork in Ethiopia and South Africa. As for the new financing instruments, I agree with the authors that it can leverage on some market-based instruments. The report already mentioned green bonds. I would add a project finance and green ABS for financing and refinancing. So the advantage of project finance for Chinese companies is it provides a channel for financing overseas projects with international capital in cases where host governments are in debt distress and bringing high credit risks. For Chinese financial institutions, cooperation with international banks and MBBs brings in the expertise on risk assessment and mitigation, lowering the risks overall for themselves. So that's the advantage. So those are the advantages of project finance in comparison to the traditional EPC plus F, often requiring solvent guarantees. As for the green ABS, asset-backed securities that can be issued domestically or abroad, it can work very well to mobilize private capital for wind and solar assets. Through aggregating and funding, the funding into a common structure, green ABS enables institutional investors to finance small-scale green assets, such as wind and solar, while at the same time helps lenders free up their balance sheets to originate new loans. For example, the deal can be backed by PPAs or loans for the installation of solar panels. So those are my 2 cents for the purpose of providing some updates here in China to complement this report. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks a lot, Sarah, for highlighting this. I think for me, I've summed up 2 critical points, really, which some of it we also identify in the report. The first one, obviously, being the lack of the green agenda from the Chinese stakeholders. And definitely, the absence of this green agenda, it affects how those companies involved in developing these projects actually, plan ahead in their overseas business ventures. But equally, the interesting pledge recently made by the Chinese government to stop the support of coal projects overseas is also going to be, I think, a game changer. And perhaps this could be one of the signals or policy signals shifting, if you want, towards supporting of renewable energy activities. So thanks for reflecting on this. And then we move on to a third speaker, who is Professor Jacqueline Maglet, who is a professor at Strathmore University in Kenya, professor in the Institute of Global Prosperity and Engineering at the University College London in the UK, as well as the Gresham Professor of Environment. By way of introducing her, her current research is focused on natural prosperity, a new philosophy for the next century that address concerns of climate change and renewable energy, impacts of pollution, improving food and nutrition systems, data analytics, and designing the Africa Regional Data Cube. Previously, she was the United Nations Environment's Chief Scientist, Director of Science and Chief Statistician leading on environmental indicators, data and assessment for the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. And before that, she was the Executive Director of the European Environmental Agency, as well as the Director of the United Kingdom Center for Coastal and Marine Sciences, where she was a Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Warwick, as well as Director of Theoretical Ecology at FZ Julich, and Senior Scientist at Bedford Institute of. I can go on. I think I will have to spend the whole day reading her bio, really.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. So, I mean, of course, I've cut a lot of things here. Professor Magdili today will speak to us around the African business environment, where I think she's more or less going to reflect on the nexus between what's happening on the ground, that is within the African continent, and where investment is coming from, and to what extent we can think around the synergies through the engineering and financing from China. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Jacqueline Maglet to reflect on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frankton. I'd just like to ask to be sharing, because I lost that capability, if I could, just to share some slides and ideas with you, if that's possible. Thank you. So what I was going to do is take a slightly, I would say bigger picture, but a picture of what we're seeing on the ground here in East Africa, and put that into the context of sustainable development, as well as think about the relationships that we see every day here in Kenya on the China-Africa front. And the reason I want to continue to come back to the Sustainable Development Goals is because people have caricatured the China model very much as an investment intensive and supply chain intensive. But there's also, in many of the projects, talks about co-benefits. And there is some evidence that we haven't really been able to succeed in either demonstrating or really bringing out those co-benefits in these large infrastructure projects. So when we talk about the goals that have to do with clean energy, actually there are many other reasons that we need to look at the other parts that are connected to it to make these things successful, both in terms of delivery, but also to think about long-term picture around what the infrastructure can deliver. And against all of that, there are a lot of global trends and pressures also to do with how people are moving around. So where people actually live today may not be where they're going to be living in the future. So planning big infrastructure projects, of course, is like looking into a crystal ball. Nevertheless, you have to really think again about Africa, because in many places, those global trends and pressures are really changing the face of where people are living. And it's not just a simple rural urban shift. The other driver, of course, as we sort of said, is the elephant in the room, is about climate change and about how much carbon we can emit. And literally, I mean, I think we're going to see in the next 2 weeks, not only the shift in thinking, but also much more concentration on how to get the right solutions on the ground. And so infrastructure needs to be more nimble, more agile to really respond to some of these challenges, because piece by piece is the only way that we're going to get on to the 1.5 degree trajectory or avoid, let's say, getting into 2. We're probably already in this hinterground here. So I want to sort of think then about the infrastructure, but how it sits alongside, particularly in Kenya, but also in East Africa, big industrial developments around energy, infrastructure, mining and waste. All of these are ongoing, and in a sense, they provide a lot of tension in governments because, you know, you only have so much capacity. And one of the challenges I can see growing is that interrelationship, the synergies that could come, don't always happen. They do in some cases. I've got one example where it has worked with a Chinese investment and Kenya, but you have to really have prescience to understand how to get the best out of some of these investment models. And of course, the downside is that we're not very good at taking care of the hidden costs, the externalities of some of the things that we're putting in place. So clearly, this is one of the big targets. It's the drawdown target, and trying to get ourselves not necessarily into net zero by 2040, but that's one of the targets that many countries are putting on the table. China, of course, is further out, but nevertheless, bending that curve downwards is where we're all going. And so renewable energy, I don't feel, has to make any more argumentation or any more excuses. Over my career, it's literally been out in the cold, then sort of allowed into the room, then a sort of little junior partner. But now, as has been said by Suji and others, we have to take it to the point where, have we got the right infrastructure in place? Have we got the transmission and all of that to be able to deliver what people really seem to see as being a great step forward, which is clean energy? So this critical year is where Africa really has to speak up as a continent, because as governments are making decisions about achieving net zero, we also realize that we've got a lot of nature-based solutions that can help us. And in Africa, it's imperative that we take that message home, that it's the land itself is extraordinarily valuable, both in terms of sequestering carbon, but also how and where you build infrastructure, how and where you create energy demand. And so in a sense, what we need is much more scalable and modular and proven methods. And the point that was being made earlier is that with the kind of Chinese model that currently exists, where maybe companies are not so interested in small scale, actually that is where we need to get. We need to almost make, like, forgive me for using the name, but the sort of Lego block approach, where we can scale down some of the expertise that we've got and hand it over, so to speak, in skill base and technical terms and maintenance terms into things that will work in a much more localized setting, and then create the jobs that come out of that. So from an African perspective, as the report has shown, the installed side of renewables is growing. Hydro is large, wind and solar. Interestingly, Irena hasn't started to put geothermal in there, but anyway, we have obviously in Africa quite a lot. But it is this issue around how the foreign direct investments in Sub-Saharan Africa, but across Africa, the continent, have got a lot of investments in general infrastructure and natural resource extraction. And it's that balance that we need to really see how they could go together, how you situate the energy side together with the resource extraction, and maybe even really reflecting what's happening around the world. Think again about how we need to stop taking so many virgin resources out of the ground, which is very energy intensive, and think more about our recycling and our waste management. So these are what I would call SDG type of concerns, where they come together as a bundle. So it's bundling things. And in that connection, in Kenya, of course, we have a lot of installed capacity. We have hydro, we've got geothermal, thermal, wind, solar, and biomass. And we're doing extraordinarily well, I think, compared to maybe other countries on the continent about the access rate. And there are some good examples of large-scale things that have gone in, both solar, but also the multi-purpose den. And that's one interesting example where there's actually a sort of a dedicated city being built with its energy source at the beginning. So that's clearly very important, the Konza Technology City and the Swaka multi-purpose dam. So thinking about that back in 2009, hardly realizable, but nevertheless happening. This combined thinking, this kind of SDG thinking, as I would say, is really starting to pay off. This is a picture of Olkaria, by the way, 5 on the geothermal, because I do quite a lot of surveys and impacts on the land and also on the communities. There isn't so much investment and production tax credits, but of course there are signs that the customs and excise rates have been moving in the right direction, also with biogas and other forms of renewables. So at low scale and high scale, these are all there. So all going in the right direction, absolutely. But then you get into some serious kind of what I would call practical problems. So we're moving along, we're getting the posts in, we're getting the poles in, we're getting the wires up, and then you arrive in a place like Sekanani, which is where I live. This is actually my village where I live, down in the Mara. And so you see all these poles in the background, and you notice there are no wires. And so unfortunately what happened was we have a last mile energy policy for the poorest to get transmission down into these areas. And genuinely it's needed because energy is an expensive item in any household. I mean, we've developed cow dung and various other ways, but if you're going down the gas route, it is expensive. So what's the problem? Well, it's the connection fee. So this infrastructure was all done for free, but that final moment when you have to put a wire from the pole onto the house, and you come to a lady, for example, who doesn't understand what a bill is, there's a missing piece here. So there still needs these last end pieces to be thought about when we take projects through. And the other point, of course, is the local solutions. This is one of the grids that I'm more familiar with. I've built sort of microgrids all over the place, actually, and they are working, and people genuinely do appreciate the kinds of materials that are being imported and now actually made in Kenya itself. So I think that's exactly the challenge, is the distributed approach, the distributed networks are essential for a country like Kenya and probably many others across Africa. Nevertheless, if we step back a moment and think about what the combinations of SDGs can bring us, there are some tremendously important processes in consumption and production that will fundamentally change the way in which we think about energy. Some of which are these, where we've got nanotubes, the way in which we develop materials that can essentially be used in energy terms in much more convenient ways, different kinds of technologies, buildings in this case that are drawing energy from water, and they get moved when there's a storm coming, so this is quite an interesting climate adaptation and so forth. And even as temperatures increase in some parts of the continent, different kinds of living spaces built into the landscape. So I repeat my plea is that as we go forward and we're rethinking the whole planet, we're thinking about how we're putting energy into the mix, we need to also consider the backdrop into which it's going. And rethinking the planet also means going into the sectors that are essentially using energy. And as we shift our thinking around agriculture, for example, where we have heavily and highly energy intensive farming on the right hand side doing a lot of damage to our land, which is vital. This is the kind of picture we have to stop. So moving over onto here, now farmers of course need to have solar power to electrify the fences and so on. So very different kind of demand for energy that's emerging. And so we can see that these things go hand in hand, and as drivers for how to get more, what I would say, comprehensive, connected ideas around energy, where we can bring other investment in. And this is investment from Africans who want to invest. It's really sort of connecting up things like the climate smart agriculture with, well, how can we deliver it? How can we get the energy into communities so they really can modify and innovate and do things in relation to climate action, and then get things into cities and so forth. So my sort of plea, having read the report, which I found fascinating, was really to say that perhaps we also, alongside of asking for a more flexible mode of how the infrastructure and the experience and the engineering happens, we do also need a lot of flexibility around the investment and then the overall decision making. How does that all happen? I know many communities that are willing to invest in their own right in the energy system, the energy infrastructure. They don't sort of quite know how to do it. So I think there's huge opportunities, but maybe it's a change of scale as well as pace that we need. So moving more quickly at a medium to local scale, that is now really the greatest demand. And maybe we can deliver some of the base loads through the big infrastructures that we have already got in place. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope to contribute to the panel now. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Professor Macleod, there for your insights here. And I particularly picked, the connection that you brought here, that, renewable energy is eventually all about how we can think around the challenge of climate change. And also the fact that you brought in the aspect of the last mile connection here, which I somehow connected to the point raised earlier by Suji around the challenges of grid-based networks, precisely, how most of the African countries are struggling to create a grid that is conducive and that is fit for purpose for its population. So without further ado now, I would like to invite Professor Jacob Mulugeta, to speak to us really more on the challenges and opportunities for scaling Chinese involvement in renewable energy in Africa. I think he will bring in an African perspective on the renewable energy sector. By way of introducing him, Professor Jacob Mulugeta is a professor of energy and development policy at the University College London, and he held an academic post at the Center for Environmental Strategy at the University of Surrey in the UK. He's also the founding member of the African Climate Policy Center at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, which is based in Ethiopia, where he worked as a senior climate and energy specialist. He has over 25 years of research and teaching, as well as advisory experience specializing in the links between energy infrastructure, as well as human welfare. So I'd like to invite you, Professor, to the platform.
Thank you, Frankton. Pleasure to be here, and also to commend you and Wayne and colleagues on this excellent report. And it is really one that that actually plugs an important hole. We know that investment from China into Africa is quite significant. It's transforming the landscape, and yet there is very little critical kind of appraisal done on that. And I think your report actually helps in that sense. Now, I mean, just before I sketch out just my somewhat scattered thoughts, I mean, I would say that, we're talking about 54 countries across Africa. And so when you look at that, the kind of the immediate problem of talking about energy in that kind of, in an African context, is the danger of course, generalization. We're talking about a vast continent with vast ecological, climate, linguistic, etc., cultural differences and so forth. But dare I say, also different policy contexts right there in East Africa, for example, where Jackie is based, has a very different policy setup as compared to next door in Ethiopia, let's say. So I think any discussion that broadly talks about Africa we run the risk of obscuring this kind of complexity and diversity that exists on the ground. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. But I think another thing to acknowledge is also this important involvement of China. China's recent footprint on Africa's infrastructure development, let's say over the past 10, 15 years, has been quite staggering. Literally, I mean, we're talking about changes, visible changes that we have seen across the continent as a result of China's presence in Africa. So I think that's something to acknowledge for the good, and also remain open to critiquing what has happened. And I think your paper lays out, or it acknowledges this important development, but also it tells us an important trend. One is that China's decreasing role in Africa's oil and gas sector, but now is being compensated by its fast-growing involvement in the power sector, mostly in hydro and coal, as colleagues have already indicated. Now, this is an important development, largely because we are also thinking in terms of electrification of energy system at a global level, and so it helps Africa to enter into that world in a meaningful way. But as Suji, Sarah, and Jackie had acknowledged, and as the paper also acknowledges, the report, that the new build in solar and wind is quite low. It's still really low, around 10 gigawatts over a period of a decade. And I think this is likely to continue unless we have major changes on the ground. So, and this is really ironic because the cost of PV and wind, for example, the prices continue to plummet and have done so over the past 10 years, but Africa is certainly trailing behind. and we still have the dominance of coal and hydro. These are the incumbents, and in many ways, that's part of the problem that we have. Partly because I think, my experience in Ethiopia, in Uganda, and various other countries is that solar and wind are still seen as kind of stopgap technologies, as transitional technologies. Hydro, for example, has, as your paper highlights, developed, very strong technical and managerial capacity around it. And so it has that incumbency, which is which supports it. And in many policy circles, hydro is seen as the kind of silver bullet option, partly because of its centralized deployment and how that supports the whole industrial infrastructure, industrial strategies, et cetera, et cetera. So it tends to crowd out the wind and solar options in real ways. But as global attention moves to solar and wind, and now we are talking about interconnection, regional interconnection, global interconnection, and we will hear next week, some big announcements about the role that wind and solar can play in global interconnection. So I feel that African countries are still unprepared, because regulations and policies are still unstable in many parts, and still some more work that needs to be done. And I think one thing I would also perhaps highlight is the off-grid and microgrid is not given sufficient attention. And yet the real, if you're talking about real changes on the ground, that's where it comes from. Visible changes, quick changes, the kinds of pictures that Jackie showed us, that's really where people are actually living. And therefore the off-grid and microgrid schemes, the smaller scale, we still haven't built enough in the policy areas, in governance setups, to be able to inspire confidence of investors, both local and international. And I think, all of us are in line with this. Now, just a quick couple of points is, I think when we're talking about China, and China is extremely relevant to this discussion, it's also important, I think Wei mentioned it at the beginning, to understand the experience of China, the history of China, and how it traveled into this journey. And I do think that African policymakers need to seriously pay attention to this experience, to this history of China's rural development journey, for example. Let's take, 1980s, early 80s or so, we had the integrated rural development approach across China that produced, local level solutions to the ones that Jackie is talking about. But this had very strong government commitment, active local participation, technological flexibility, all the things that we are talking about right now, with very strong emphasis around rural development through agricultural as well as industrial activities, and emphasis, on capacity building and training, etc. So this is a tangible experience that one can draw from. This was a Chinese homegrown model, with significant number of pilot projects, small hydro, biogas, and biomass technologies, etc. So I think that's one thing, to keep in mind. The other is, in an attachment with this is to remember that this, China's so-called miracle did not just land, from the moon. It didn't just, happen from the heavens. I think, there is, again, policymakers, planners worked extra hard to try and adapt technologies, to the objective conditions in China. I think, there's plenty of lessons there that we can draw in terms of the process of actually developing pilot projects and how they can actually lead us towards crafting, good policies. I think, that's something, to keep in mind. Now, in terms of, I think, concrete things, about what to do, I think, concessional finance, of course, is important, but maybe there is some room to try and rebalance this where it comes from. The paper talks about, maybe some of it can come through development finance institutions, and that's something which could be explored further. The other is, of course, what we've been talking about is having, these long-term targets and the right kind of policy signals that take us towards large scale, but also small scale wind and energy programs. I think adjusting tariffs in ways that that open up, that cater for poor communities is something that needs to be taken into consideration, serious consideration. I mean, at the moment, what we have is a tariff policy which is very blunt, as a blunt instrument, which also serves the need of those who don't need help. For example, Ethiopia's tariff, or most tariffs across the region are set in ways that don't necessarily support those who are in need of connection. Thinking in terms of co-benefits, I don't think I'll spend much time in it. I think Jackie did an eloquent job on this in terms of jobs and local content and technological learning and so forth to ensure that happens. One last point is the issue of unlocking domestic finance. So finance often is seen as something that comes from outside, but rather, there is money inside countries. How can we use resources that are domestically located from those who are able to invest in joint ventures, perhaps with China and others? So I think the policies around this are going to be quite critical. Sorry, Frank, I went on and on.
That's fine. Thanks a lot, Jakob, for these interesting insights. So to sum up what you have already said, I think the point of kind of learning from the experiences of China, not necessarily to copy as such, but to learn, from those experiences in the case of how do they manage to do that. I mean, if we check the graph which we showed earlier on, you check there's this peak from the 70s, 80s in terms of building infrastructure in the context of energy. But what can we learn from those experiences? And I also like the fact that as much as we are speaking of Africa, there's also a danger of generalizing, given that we are speaking to 55 plus countries, each and every African country have got their own political and governing structures and systems, as well as the policy framework and institutions, regulations, all we have a role in terms of determining how Chinese actually can be involved in developing a renewable energy sector in that context. And the fact that we also have to think about balancing the sources of these concessional finances, Africa is not only locked to the Chinese, if you want, we can think of Western players as well. At the end of the day, it's all about balancing and see what contributions each of these players can play. And perhaps the final point I would like to also emphasize on here is to, provide the right policy signals, which also connects to what Jackie said earlier on. But equally, what we have seen is that most of these policy signals, they tend to focus on a large scale or grid-based connections. And in most cases, there's this sort of absent policy framework around, for example, off-grid or mini-grid. So this is something really to think about. So without further ado now, I would like to open the floor for discussion. And I've seen there are quite a number of questions that have already been asked by our audience. And perhaps for a start, I would kind of like to reiterate the question which was asked by, is it Hong Mei Lee? And I think where you were considering answering this. So the question reads as follows. Renewable energy is eco-friendly. May I ask, other than technology and contracting, any idea how much investment is from China? And what do you think China wants to gain from all these involvements?
As I said, the precise data is very difficult to acquire. We have different databases regarding the size of the investment, ranging from 30 plus billion to 50 plus billion US dollars being invested in Africa in the past decade. But again, it is a very rough estimation. And the reason is, but we can say that the truth is somewhere in between, behind this 35 to 52 billion US dollars. If you look at John Hopkins database and also the Boston University's database. But I would like to highlight why, to answer these questions, is already reflect some realities on the ground, is that we have very little official data, but lots of misinformation on the internet. But at the same time, the lot of terms are misused here regarding, for example, sometimes they're looking at foreign investment, sometimes they're looking at contractor agreement, EPC contract, sometimes it is about technology supply only, and the partial equity investment. So the blended picture of all types of transactions make it more complicated to predict. So that's the picture. I'm sorry that I can't give you an authoritative figure at the moment. It's just a roughly estimation. And what China can gain. I think in the past 2 decades, according to academic literature, it is increasingly clear that the gain is mainly commercial. It's like the Chinese, all these institutions we've been talking about in the past 2 decades, it's about advancing a kind of mercantilist interests that they're trying to boost Chinese kind of merchandise, industrial and the commercial interests of these SOEs. We have a kind of a misunderstanding of the role of SOEs in China. We think that they're kind of forearms of government agencies advancing political strategy. But at least in the first 2 or 3 decades, that's not the case. These are kind of independent agencies advancing their own interests. But increasingly, because of the geopolitical situation changed a lot in a couple of years, there might be some political considerations regarding the political benefits of these projects. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the response. Where, yeah, definitely it's quite difficult to estimate the correct figure in terms of the volume of Chinese investments in the energy sector. And I also forgot to introduce Yushi Chen, who is also the author of the report. And he's a doctoral researcher at Science Policy Research Unity at the University of Sussex. And he is the lead research on digital alliance at the Institute for Digital Finance, climate fintech advisor for Fintech for Good. And he's a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University in China. So he'll be also involved in responding to some of the questions that audience might potentially have. Then I think Hong Mei Li also kind of made a follow-up question specifically around issues of affordability and sustainability. So he's asking whether these are the crucial obstacles in terms of scaling Chinese renewable energy projects in Africa. I wonder if any of the panelists would like to pick this up.
I could just say something very briefly on the affordability question. I think households across the continent definitely realize that energy is a big part of it, and living as we do in a lot of situations where the rural population are using biomass, but it's impacting on health. There are other agencies at work to try to get that affordability concept across, because the payoffs, the co-benefits, let's say, of tackling smoke, indoor air pollution and so on are so significant that actually it isn't just about the energy, it's about the whole health of the family. And because of that, I'm sort of seeing a lot more traction from my conversations in the UN financing when we talk to many other countries, that actually is the entry point. It's quite interesting. It's a different entry point, very powerful, and of course brought on also by the COVID requirements and people realizing, that breathing is so absolutely essential. So I think the affordability piece, whilst it was previously, I think it was the big driver. Now I think it's different. I actually think it's about health and it's about people's health, and that's a welcome change, because I think that's the way that we will get different kinds of financing instruments to really bed down. Anyway, that's just an observation I've made in the last 2 years, but certainly in the last year over COVID.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. I think there's an anonymous attendee here who has an interesting question, specifically around trying to find a win-win solution with regards to developing renewable energy. So I think the attendee is thinking around how can we balance the commercial as well as the environmental and socio-economic benefits in developing these renewable energies. So if we can have someone who can respond to that.
Can I kick in? I think the win-win solution is a kind of a dominant narratives and in Chinese policies in promoting BRI projects. But I think it's a very how to say important concept that in particularly in renewables, because it links to Jacqueline's ideas about synergies. About synergies, not just in a technical way, but it's about synergy of co-benefits, and not just about co-benefits of certain group, but it's like providing benefits to different groups at the same time. And which is, for example, we have a lot of innovations. We talk about technical potentials, for example, providing solar panels on the lake, and so on. So even on the different scenarios, and even in the desert and so far. But I think the ultimate purpose is to provide co-benefits to different group of people, so that we can have not just the synergized benefits, but synergized interest and consolidated kind of a preferences from different corners of policy stakeholders. So that is the win-win is really talk about. But the challenge based on that is that how to design a business model and financial model that really is supporting this kind of a win-win scenarios and different benefits to different people, because they have different time frame, because this set of benefits, long-term social and economic benefits, can happen in about 5 or 10 years time, when the solar panel need to be installed in 2 years time, and the time gap is so different, and some of the benefits is wait to be long-term to be same, and how to evaluate, how to integrate it into the financial model, into the business model, to convince the investors to come into this area, to even consider these co-benefits included in all the kind of a transaction costs. That is the real challenge that we face, and to reconsider win-win in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose Jakob, you can jump in here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, just to add to that, what Wei is talking about. I mean, I think, when you look at the climate issue, when you look at development, time is something has become an important factor. Of course, making sure that decarbonization happens quickly and now is something which is definitely has to be inscribed into policies. So I think as we explore the whole issue of win-win, the mission to address climate and social challenges is something which has to be at the forefront of any kind of policy. And to a large degree, I do think that if we look at a kind of a bottom-up type of an approach in terms of how we address real needs and real demands from people, that becomes the starting point, instead of, because there is a tendency to focus on the supply side, increase the supply side, and then the demand will follow. But rather, to start thinking differently from a bottom up is one way to try and see win-win, if to use that word. Thanks.
Excellent. All right. Thanks a lot, Jakob, there. And there's also an interesting question coming from one of our participants, who is my colleague at the Open University, Dr. Michael Ngoasong. So his point is adjusting tariffs to ensure benefits to the poor and policies are important. Are there any examples of investment-ready policies in China that can serve as key learning points, particularly for the African context? I think this is more or less speaking to the point which Jakob raised earlier on around adjusting tariffs in the sector. I don't know if you'd want to speak to this or anyone among the panelists would like to jump into this.
there was a specific request for a lesson from China. No?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, saying, do we have any policies from China around this tariff adjustment that can serve as a learning kind of frameworks for African countries?
Tariff adjustments, I think, like anywhere, is a political struggle.
Right.
It's not a technical. It's not just a technical issue, but it is the cornerstone of all the green industrial policies, and the only principle that might be applied to all the contexts is to make it transparent and accountable as much as possible, but not kind of closed behind closed door negotiations of the big powers. That's the only way to make it transparent to the public, because it's public money in anyway, and everybody is responsible to make final decision. That will make the adjustment less political. To be frankly, when you have more actors, it's actually less political. And in China, it's also about information asymmetry, which is related to technological side of how to identify the cost structure of the energy companies nowadays. We do have more technologies based on AI, based on big data and so on. So that renders another some kind of leverage for government to identify the fast changing cost structures and to make decisions. But again, the difficulty is thinking long term. And how long is long, how long is appropriate, is a very technical issue. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I mean, as Wei said here, it's a political struggle, really. I mean, we have notable cases. One of the African countries that I tend to work in is Ethiopia, where we have seen the question of tariff adjustment has been ongoing for quite some time. And on one end, you have developers who are saying that if we are to venture into the market, you know, the cost of generating does not reflect the cost of selling. So in other words, how can we match this? You know, so on the other side, you have the kind of those in the power saying we need to produce or generate electricity that will be affordable for our population, you know. So it becomes a more or less of a political economy question. Then how do you balance that? I thought I would just reflect on this. Do we have additional question, or did I see a hand there? Let me see.
Yeah, build on the discussion we just had. I think there's definitely a role for new emerging technology in play in these things. I think here we discuss this co-evolutionary framework between energy system and financial system. We both can see like digitalization, decarbonization, and decentralization happened into system. We discuss like to meet the carbon neutrality need to develop a renewable energy centered energy system. By achieving that, definitely we need some distributed energy or financial resources to support those small projects. One side we discussed in the panel that we can mobilize local serving to support local infrastructure. At the same time, we can develop new like digital finance tools to support those sustainable financing and energy transition. Yeah, that's my comment.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for your input there, Yoshi. In the panel, you can raise your hand if you have a question, then I would ask our technical team to open your mic, and then you can speak directly. We still have a bit of some time, so if you have a question, please feel free to ask. Kelly, do we have any questions from the audience? I can't see it from my front.
Not at the moment, Brenton.
Okay, it's great then. It seems we were spot on, you know. If you really find a question, it means you were speaking to what people were expecting to hear. I think there's okay, when
What about when
Are we
Yeah, there's one
expecting
here
the-
about the report to be public. Yeah, if you've seen it, yeah.
Yeah, so the report will be published, I think, in a matter of few days' time. It's ready. We're just negotiating the platform for which it will be launched. So I think for all the panelists who sent directly, but equally will also show you where it is. And with this now, I would like to, if we no longer have any additional questions. Oh, okay, Jakob, please go ahead.
I mean, it's a broad question, perhaps for all of us. You know, as we're looking into the future and China's involvement in infrastructure efforts across Africa, and I think in a way you did indicate that there needs to be a kind of a critical sort of engagement from both the China side and the African side in terms of you know, having that sort of relationship go through its own kind of dialectics. You know, you have to question, you have to evaluate, you have then your risk sketch and so forth. So as we look into the future, do we expect that relationship to change? Because there are also external agencies, both to China and also Africa in terms of, you know, global processes and so forth. So I mean, I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball and give us a sense of future relationships.
I think Sarah and Sujie will be a better voice to talk about what are they doing and what's they're expecting in the future. I do expect more people from organizations like ISD, the Green Finance Institute, and from engineering consultancy side to strengthening the environmental and social impact assessment. We have a lot of, hopefully we'll have a lot of capacity buildings because of the transition out of the coal, which is about 20% of the finance and capacity gap in the next 10 years. And otherwise, it's a failed project. I mean, if we think about how to meet the third challenge of low carbon transition, if we can't meet the first two about energy access and affordability and the reliability, the third pillar cannot be achieved at all. So it must be a kind of, yeah, it's bundled together. You need to be delivered together. But the first two is the fundamental ones. So we need China to think about its own history. And sorry, I need to be a little bit critical. Is that sometimes China misinterpret their own history as well. They advance the state-backed finance too much. But think about their, you mentioned biogas, you mentioned about small hydro in the 70s. They do that along with Three Gorges now.
Right.
It's a controlled improvisation that going on from bottom up together with strong state support. Such system need to be, we need exchange, a lot of exchange on this round with a lot of people, even from historical perspectives. That's my, just the thoughts. And hopefully it happens, but let's see. Yeah.
All right, thanks a lot, Wei there. And yeah, well, let me take this time to thank our panelists, Professor Jakob Nligeta, Professor Jacqueline McLeod, Yingji Sarah Tang, Sujie Chow, as well as Wei Shen and Yushi Chen for the time you have committed to finally be part of the conversations around scaling Chinese involvement in Africa's renewable energy sector. I did enjoy the conversation and intellectual engagements here. And on that note, I would like to invite Salim Freke, the Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation, to bring this to close. Over to you.
I'm not going to say a lot because we've run out of time. Just to say this was a really brilliant session, and Frankton, you chaired it very well, and Wei Shen for opening up the discussion, and really excellent panel. Just to say that going forward, the African Climate Foundation is going to work with IDS on looking further at the role of China, particularly in expanding the scope of China's role on the continent. And it talks to sort of Jakob's question as well. And I think really to try to embrace a kind of dialogue, or you call it dialectics, which is my favorite word of mine as well, to try to figure out how China can also make policy shifts to stronger policy shifts towards expanding the scope of financing and development of green technologies on the continent. Obviously, we as Africans, we have to also organize ourselves to have more coherence in policy and be able to transform the minerals base we have to also green industrial capability in the long term. So I want to thank all of you, particularly Kelly and others who have pulled this meeting together, Francis, and just for the IDS, Sussex, and the Open University for their generous collaboration with the African Climate Foundation. Thank you all, and all the best. Look forward to another meeting with all of you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.